The chill of the ancestral stones seeped into Lady Eleanor's very bones, a coldness that mirrored the one in her heart. She had married Alistair, the formidable Duke of Ashworth, with the naive hope of love, or at least companionship. Instead, she found herself entombed within the gilded cage of Ashworth Manor, a prisoner of his icy indifference and increasingly cruel whims. Each night, the heavy oak door to her separate bedchamber closed, a final, echoing pronouncement of her solitude. She bore the weight of his disdain, the sharp words, the dismissive gestures, all hidden beneath the veneer of ducal propriety. But the bruises, the bruises were a different matter entirely. They were a secret she guarded with desperate ferocity, a testament to a darkness that festered beneath the Duke's impeccable facade. One evening, a sudden gust of wind, a trembling hand, and a dropped candle would shatter the carefully constructed illusion, illuminating not just the shadowed corridor, but the stark, undeniable evidence of her silent suffering. If you are listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has travelled. Lady Eleanor Beaumont had been raised in a world of delicate silks, hushed whispers, and the rigid expectations of Victorian society. Her childhood, though privileged, was a carefully orchestrated performance, each movement dictated by the invisible strings of decorum and duty. Her father, the Earl of Cranbrook, a man of ancient lineage but dwindling fortune, had instilled in her the paramount importance of a suitable match. Eleanor, with her striking auburn hair, eyes the colour of moss after a spring rain, and a spirit that yearned for more than tea parties and embroidery, had always dreamed of a love that transcended mere arrangement. She devoured romantic novels in secret, imagining a husband who would see beyond her dowry, who would cherish her intellect and her quiet passion for painting. When the proposal from Alistair, the Duke of Ashworth, arrived, it was met with a mixture of awe and relief in the Beaumont household. The Duke was a man of immense wealth, impeccable lineage, and a reputation for being stern but just. His estates stretched across 3 counties, his influence reached the highest echelons of Parliament, and his name commanded respect, if not affection. He was also, by all accounts, a man of imposing stature and formidable intellect, though his countenance was often described as unyielding. Eleanor, at 19, was considered a prize, and the Duke, at 35, a most eligible, if somewhat intimidating, bachelor. Her initial encounters with the Duke were formal, almost clinical. He spoke of property, of lineage, of the duties of a duchess, never once of shared interests or personal affections. Eleanor, however, tried to find glimmers of the man she hoped he might be. She admired his sharp mind, his knowledge of classical literature, and the way he held himself with an air of undeniable authority. Perhaps, she reasoned, love would blossom from respect, from shared purpose. Her mother, Lady Beatrice, a woman whose own marriage had been one of convenience, assured her that affection would grow with time, like a sturdy oak. A duke's wife, Eleanor, she had said, her voice laced with a wistful pride, has a position of unparalleled influence. You will want for nothing. And indeed, Eleanor wanted for nothing in terms of material possessions. Ashworth Manor was a monument to Victorian grandeur, a sprawling Gothic revival edifice nestled amidst acres of manicured gardens and ancient woodlands. Its halls were lined with ancestral portraits, its libraries filled with leather-bound volumes, and its drawing rooms adorned with priceless antiques. Servants moved with silent efficiency, anticipating every need. Yet, beneath the veneer of opulence, Eleanor felt a growing sense of unease. The Duke, while never overtly unkind in public, maintained a chilling distance. His eyes, the colour of a winter sky, rarely met hers, and his conversation was always directed towards matters of estate management or social obligations. The wedding itself was a grand affair, a spectacle of societal importance. Eleanor, resplendent in white satin and lace, felt a tremor of both excitement and trepidation as she walked down the aisle of the ancient parish church. The Duke, Standing tall and unsmiling at the altar, looked every inch the powerful nobleman. Their vows were exchanged, their hands joined, and the union was sealed before God and society. The reception at Ashworth Manor was lavish, a blur of champagne, polite conversation, and the admiring glances of guests. Eleanor, though exhausted, tried to project the image of a radiant bride, her smile fixed, her laughter light. As the last guest departed and the vast manor fell silent, a nervous anticipation fluttered in Eleanor's chest. This was it, the moment her new life truly began. She imagined a quiet conversation, perhaps a shared moment of intimacy, a gentle beginning to their marital journey. Her maid, Mrs. Finch, a kindly woman with a perpetually worried expression, helped her out of her heavy gown and into a delicate nightdress of silk and lace. Eleanor dismissed her with a grateful smile, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. She waited in her bedchamber, a vast room dominated by a four-poster bed draped in heavy velvet. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the scent of lavender filled the air. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The silence grew heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Just as a cold dread began to settle in her stomach, a soft knock came at the door. It was the Duke. He stood on the threshold, still in his evening attire, his expression unreadable. His gaze swept over the room, then briefly, dismissively over her. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She expected him to enter, to speak, to offer some gesture of marital connection. Instead, he remained rooted to the spot, his hands clasped behind his back. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth, "I trust you find your chambers to your liking." "Yes, Alistair," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "They are magnificent." He nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible movement. "Good. Then there is something we must discuss." He paused, and Eleanor braced herself, her heart sinking with an inexplicable premonition. "I believe it is best for us to maintain separate bedchambers. It is a custom I prefer, one that allows for greater personal space and uninterrupted rest. My chambers are at the end of the west wing. Yours, as you know, are here." Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend. Separate bedchambers? On their wedding night? The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Her romantic dreams, her naive hopes, shattered into 1,000 pieces around her. The golden cage had just been locked, and she was its sole bewildered occupant. The Duke offered no explanation, no apology, no softening of the blow. He simply stated it as a fact, an unalterable decree. "But, Alistair," she began, her voice trembling, "surely, as husband and wife." He cut her off with a raised hand, his expression hardening. "There is no surely in this matter, Eleanor. My decision is final. We have fulfilled our societal obligations. The heir will come in time when it is deemed appropriate. Until then, we shall maintain separate residences within this house. Good night, Duchess." With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the silent corridor, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the vast, cold room, the heavy door closing softly behind him, sealing her fate in the golden cage. The silence that followed was not peaceful, but a deafening roar of shattered expectations and profound loneliness. The days that followed the wedding night blurred into a monotonous routine of polite appearances and crushing solitude. Eleanor, now Duchess of Ashworth, moved through the grand halls of the manor like a ghost, her presence acknowledged by the servants but rarely by her husband. The Duke maintained his distance, his schedule meticulously planned, his interactions with her limited to formal dinners or necessary social engagements. He was always courteous in public, a perfect picture of the distinguished nobleman. But in private, his indifference was a palpable, suffocating presence. Eleanor tried desperately to fulfill her duties as Duchess. She oversaw the household staff, managed the estate accounts, and hosted the required social gatherings with a grace that belied her inner turmoil. She learned to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of Ashworth Manor, both literally and figuratively, always careful to avoid her husband's path unless summoned. Her days were filled with a quiet despair, her nights with restless sleep, haunted by the echoing silence of her separate bedchamber. The emotional abuse began subtly, a slow erosion of her spirit. It started with dismissive remarks about her opinions, then criticisms of her appearance, her intelligence, her very being. "Your thoughts on the agricultural reforms are quite naive, Eleanor," he would say, his voice laced with a condescending tone that made her flush with shame. "Perhaps you should concern yourself with matters more suited to a woman's understanding. Or, your dress, while adequate, lacks the sophistication one expects of a duchess." He never raised his voice, never uttered a harsh word in front of others, but his quiet barbs were more cutting than any shout. Eleanor, who had once been a spirited and intelligent young woman, found herself shrinking, her confidence withering under his constant disapproval. She began to second-guess every decision, every word, every gesture. She tried to anticipate his moods, to become the perfect silent duchess he seemed to desire. She spent hours in the library, educating herself on estate management, on politics, on anything that might earn his respect. But her efforts were always met with the same cold indifference or a dismissive wave of his hand. Then came the physical manifestations of his control, though never direct violence. It began with a firm grip on her arm, a squeeze that left faint marks when she dared to voice an opinion he disliked in private. Then a shove, a push against a wall, always in the privacy of a secluded corridor or a rarely used sitting room. He never struck her with his fist, never left a visible bruise on her face or hands, places that might be seen by others. His cruelty was more insidious, more calculated. He would corner her, his imposing height and stern gaze making her feel small and trapped, and then, with a sudden, unexpected movement, he would push her, hard enough to make her stumble, to hit her back against a piece of furniture or the unforgiving stone wall. The first time it happened, she was so shocked she could barely breathe. He had been criticizing her choice of flowers for a dinner party, his voice low and menacing. When she tried to explain her reasoning, he had simply pushed her against the heavy oak door, the impact jarring her spine. He then walked away without another word, leaving her trembling and in pain. She nursed the ache in her back in secret, her shame a heavy cloak. Her only solace came from Mrs. Finch, her maid, a woman who had served the Ashworth family for decades and possessed a keen eye for unspoken truths. Mrs. Finch, with her gentle hands and knowing glances, often seemed to sense Eleanor's distress. She would bring her extra cups of soothing tea, linger a moment longer while brushing her hair, or offer a comforting word about the beauty of the gardens. She never directly questioned Eleanor about her husband, but her quiet presence was a balm to Eleanor's wounded spirit. One afternoon, as Mrs. Finch was helping Eleanor change into a riding habit, she noticed a faint discoloration on Eleanor's upper arm. Her fingers paused, and her gaze met Eleanor's in the mirror. Eleanor quickly pulled her sleeve down, her cheeks burning. Mrs. Finch said nothing, but her eyes, usually so kind, held a flicker of deep concern, a silent acknowledgement that Eleanor was not alone in her observation. Eleanor's internal conflict raged. She was the Duchess of Ashworth, a woman of high standing, yet she lived in fear within her own home. The shame of her situation was overwhelming. How could she, a woman of her position, admit to such a degradation? What would society say? What would her family think? She had been raised to believe that a wife's duty was to her husband, to maintain the sanctity of her marriage at all costs. To speak out would be to invite scandal, to destroy her family's reputation, and to expose herself to public ridicule. So, she suffered in silence, perfecting the art of concealing her pain, both emotional and physical. The bruises on her back became a grim map of her suffering, a constellation of purples and yellows hidden beneath her elaborate gowns. She learned to dress carefully, to move with a certain stiffness that masked the tenderness of her skin. Each new mark was a fresh wound to her spirit, a reminder of her powerlessness. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where the Duke had publicly belittled her knowledge of local politics, Eleanor retired to her chambers, her head throbbing. She had tried to defend her position, only to be met with his cold, dismissive laughter. Later, in the privacy of their shared study, he had cornered her, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "You dare to contradict me in front of my guests, Eleanor," he had hissed, his voice dangerously low. "You forget your place." And with a sudden violent shove, he had sent her sprawling against the heavy mahogany desk, the sharp edge digging into her lower back. She lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, the pain a searing fire. He simply turned and walked out, leaving her to pick herself up, her dignity in tatters. Later, Mrs. Finch found her weeping silently in her bedchamber, clutching a cold compress to her back. The maid's eyes, filled with a profound sorrow, met Eleanor's. Mrs. Finch gently helped her undress, her touch feather-light as she saw the angry red mark already blooming into a dark bruise. She applied a soothing balm, her silence more eloquent than any words. Eleanor knew then that her secret was not entirely her own. The shame, however, remained, a suffocating weight that kept her trapped in her silent suffering. The autumn winds howled around Ashworth Manor, rattling the ancient windows and sending shivers through the stone walls. It was a night of particular gloom, mirroring the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Eleanor's life. The Duke had been in a foul temper all day, his criticisms sharper, his dismissals more frequent. Eleanor had spent the afternoon in the library, seeking refuge in the pages of a forgotten novel, but even the fictional world offered little escape from the gnawing anxiety that had become her constant companion. That evening, a grand dinner party was to be held, a gathering of influential peers and their wives. Eleanor, despite her inner turmoil, had to present a flawless facade. Mrs. Finch, with her usual quiet efficiency, helped her into a gown of deep emerald velvet, its heavy fabric designed to conceal, not reveal. As Mrs. Finch fastened the intricate buttons down Eleanor's back, her fingers brushed against a particularly tender spot. Eleanor winced, a small involuntary gasp escaping her lips. Mrs. Finch paused, her brow furrowed with concern, but said nothing, merely continuing her task with a gentler touch. The dinner was a strained affair for Eleanor. She forced smiles, engaged in polite conversation, and endured the Duke's subtle put-downs with practiced grace. He seemed to delight in correcting her, in subtly undermining her intelligence in front of their guests. By the time the last course was served, Eleanor felt utterly drained, her head aching, her back throbbing from the day's earlier incident. A sharp push against the newel post of the grand staircase when she had hesitated to obey his command to fetch a forgotten document. Later that night, after the guests had retired and the manor was once again cloaked in silence, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. The pain in her back was a dull, persistent ache, and her mind raced with the day's humiliations. She decided to seek a calming tonic from the small medicine cabinet in her dressing room. The gaslights in her bedchamber had been dimmed, casting long, dancing shadows. She carried a single flickering candle, its flame a fragile beacon against the encroaching darkness. As she reached the dressing room, a sudden, violent gust of wind, finding its way through a poorly sealed window, swept through the chamber. The draught extinguished the candle flame, plunging the room into near-total darkness. Startled, Eleanor cried out softly, her hand instinctively reaching out to steady herself. In her haste, her fingers fumbled, and the heavy brass candlestick slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly to the polished wooden floor. The sound, though not deafening, echoed through the silent wing of the manor. Almost immediately, Eleanor heard footsteps approaching, swift and purposeful. A moment later, the door to her bedchamber swung open, revealing the imposing figure of the Duke, holding a lantern aloft. His face, usually so composed, was etched with a rare expression of alarm. "Eleanor, what is the meaning of this noise?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Eleanor, still disoriented by the sudden darkness and the pain in her back, turned to face him. The lantern light, bright and unforgiving, illuminated her figure. She had been in the process of reaching for the tonic, and in her distress, her nightdress had slipped slightly, exposing a portion of her bare back. The Duke's gaze, initially fixed on her face, dropped. His eyes widened, a flicker of something akin to shock or perhaps even horror crossing his features. The lantern light, held high, cast a stark, undeniable illumination on her skin. There, stark against the pale canvas of her back, was a tapestry of purples, blues and yellows, the unmistakable, brutal evidence of repeated blows. The fresh, angry red mark from the Newell Post incident stood out vividly amidst the older, fading bruises. Eleanor felt a cold dread wash over her. Her secret, so carefully guarded, so desperately hidden, was exposed. She instinctively tried to cover herself, but it was too late. The Duke had seen. His breath hitched, and he took an involuntary step back, his face paling. The lantern trembled slightly in his hand, casting the gruesome tableau in an unsteady light. Just then, another figure appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. It was Lord Julian Ashworth, the Duke's younger brother, who had been staying at the manor for the dinner party. Julian, a man of warmer disposition and a keen observer, had always held a quiet concern for Eleanor. He had noticed her subdued demeanor, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the shadows beneath her eyes. He carried a smaller lamp, and as he stepped into the room, his gaze, too, fell upon Eleanor's exposed back. A gasp escaped Julian's lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock and outrage. His eyes, usually so gentle, hardened with a fierce protectiveness. He looked from Eleanor's bruised back to his brother's ashen face, and a terrible understanding dawned upon him. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken accusations, with the weight of a terrible truth finally brought to light. Eleanor, her face burning with shame and fear, felt utterly vulnerable, exposed not just to her tormentor, but to a potential ally. She braced herself for the Duke's fury, for another torrent of abuse, but he remained frozen, his gaze fixed on the evidence of his own cruelty. Julian, however, was not frozen. He moved swiftly, placing his lamp on a nearby table, and then, with a gentle but firm hand, he guided Eleanor away from the harsh light, shielding her from his brother's gaze. He then turned to the Duke, his voice low and trembling, with barely suppressed rage. "Alistair," he said, his voice a dangerous whisper, "what in God's name have you done?" The Duke, still pale, stammered, It's nothing, Julian, a misunderstanding. Eleanor is prone to clumsiness." But Julian merely shook his head, his eyes blazing. He had seen the pattern, the extent of the damage. This was no mere clumsiness. This was deliberate, sustained cruelty. He looked at Eleanor, his expression softening with profound pity and a fierce resolve. "Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle, "you are safe now. I will not allow this to continue." The words, simple yet powerful, were a lifeline in the suffocating darkness. Eleanor, for the first time in months, felt a flicker of hope, a fragile spark in the desolate landscape of her despair. Julian's presence, his unwavering gaze, his protective stance, offered a promise of intervention, a shield against the darkness that had consumed her. The dropped candle had not just revealed her bruises, it had ignited a path towards a reckoning. The morning after the accidental revelation dawned cold and grey, mirroring the tension that hung heavy in the air of Ashworth Manor. Eleanor had spent a restless night in her bedchamber, Julian having insisted on stationing a trusted footman outside her door. The shame of her exposed secret warred with a nascent sense of relief. The truth was out, and with it, a terrifying uncertainty about her future. Julian, true to his word, had not let the matter rest. He had confronted his brother in the Duke's study, a confrontation that had echoed through the silent halls, though the exact words were muffled. Eleanor could only imagine the fury and denial that must have erupted from Alistair. Later that morning, Julian sought out Eleanor. He found her in the small, sunlit conservatory, tending to her beloved orchids, her hands trembling slightly as she misted the delicate petals. He approached her gently, his face etched with a mixture of concern and determination. "Eleanor," he began, his voice soft, "we need to speak, properly." She turned, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Julian, what will happen now?" He took her hands, his grip firm and reassuring. "What will happen is that you will no longer suffer in silence. I have seen what Alistair has done. It is unforgivable. I have sent for Dr. Alaric Thorne, a trusted physician and a man of discretion. He will examine you and his testimony will be crucial." Eleanor flinched. "A doctor? Julian, the scandal, my family, the Duke's reputation." Damn his reputation," Julian interjected, his voice rising with uncharacteristic vehemence. "What about your life, Eleanor? Your well-being? This is not a matter of reputation. It is a matter of your safety and your very soul. Alistair is a brute, and he must be held accountable." His conviction was a powerful force, and for the first time, Eleanor felt a surge of something other than fear, a flicker of righteous anger. She had been so conditioned to silence, to obedience, that the idea of speaking out felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Dr. Thorne arrived shortly thereafter, a kind-faced man with intelligent, sympathetic eyes. His examination was thorough and gentle, his expression growing increasingly grim as he documented the extent of Eleanor's injuries. He spoke little, but his quiet nods and the compassionate look in his eyes conveyed his understanding. "Duchess," he said, his voice low, "these injuries are consistent with repeated physical assault. They are not accidental." His words, spoken with medical authority, were a powerful validation of her suffering. With Dr. Thorne's report in hand, Julian arranged a formal confrontation. He insisted that Eleanor be present, not as a victim to be spoken for, but as a witness to her own truth. The meeting took place in the Duke's study, a room that had witnessed so much of Eleanor's silent torment. Present were the Duke, Julian, Dr. Thorne, and to Eleanor's surprise, Mrs. Finch, who stood quietly by the door, her presence a silent testament of support. The Duke, his face a mask of cold fury, initially denied everything. "This is an outrageous fabrication. My wife is hysterical, prone to flights of fancy. These are old injuries, perhaps from a fall or a riding accident." Julian stepped forward, placing Dr. Thorne's detailed report on the Duke's desk. "The doctor's findings contradict your claims, Alistair. The nature and varying stages of these bruises indicate a pattern of abuse, not a single accident, and Mrs. Finch here can attest to Eleanor's distress and the frequency of her accidents." Mrs. Finch, usually so timid, surprised everyone by stepping forward. Her voice, though soft, was clear and unwavering. "Your Grace, I have seen the Duchess's suffering. I have tended to her injuries. She has been in fear for many months." The Duke's face contorted in a snarl. "You dare to accuse me, a Duke of the realm, based on the word of a hysterical woman and a common servant?" It was then that Eleanor, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed, spoke. Her voice, though trembling at first, grew steadier with each word. "I dare, Alistair, because it is the truth. You have subjected me to months of emotional cruelty and physical intimidation. You have used your power to control and hurt me. I have lived in fear, in shame, and in silence, but no longer." Her words hung in the air, shocking in their directness. The Duke stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning panic. He had never expected her to speak, to defy him. He had broken her spirit, or so he thought. Julian seized the moment. "Alistair, this is a matter of grave concern. If this were to become public, the scandal would ruin you. Not just your reputation, but your standing in society, your political influence. I will not stand by and watch you destroy Eleanor, nor will I allow you to bring such disgrace upon our family name." The threat was clear. Julian, as the Duke's brother, held significant sway. He was respected, and his word carried weight. The Duke, for all his arrogance, understood the power of public opinion and the devastating consequences of a scandal involving a duchess and physical abuse. His carefully constructed world of power and control began to crack. "What do you propose?" Alistair finally ground out, his voice hoarse, his gaze still fixed on Eleanor, a flicker of something akin to fear in his eyes. "Separation," Julian stated firmly. "A formal separation with a generous allowance for Eleanor and her complete freedom from your influence. She will reside elsewhere, perhaps with our aunt, Lady Agatha, in Bath, and you will never, under any circumstances, approach her again. If you refuse, I will ensure this matter is brought before the highest courts, and the full extent of your cruelty will be laid bare for all of England to see." Eleanor listened, her heart pounding. Separation, freedom. The words were almost too beautiful to comprehend. She looked at Julian, her eyes filled with gratitude. He had become her unexpected champion, her shield against the darkness. The Duke, defeated and cornered, finally slumped into his chair, his face pale and drawn. The reckoning had come, and he, the formidable Duke of Ashworth, was utterly exposed. The turning point had arrived, and Eleanor, though still bruised, felt the first stirrings of hope for a life reclaimed. The formal separation from the Duke of Ashworth was a complex and arduous process, fraught with the legal and social challenges inherent in Victorian society. A woman, even a duchess, had limited rights, and the concept of marital abuse was rarely acknowledged, let alone prosecuted. However, Julian's unwavering support, combined with Dr. Thorne's meticulous report and Mrs. Finch's quiet testimony, provided Eleanor with an unprecedented advantage. Julian, leveraging his own influence and the threat of public scandal, negotiated fiercely on Eleanor's behalf. Eleanor moved to Bath, to the elegant townhouse of Lady Agatha, Julian's and Alistair's formidable but kind-hearted aunt. Lady Agatha, a widow of sharp wit and independent spirit, welcomed Eleanor with open arms and a knowing glance. She had always suspected Alistair's coldness masked a darker nature, and she was fiercely protective of her family, especially those who had been wronged. Life with Lady Agatha was a revelation. The townhouse, though smaller than Ashworth Manor, was filled with warmth, laughter, and intellectual conversation. Lady Agatha encouraged Eleanor to pursue her interests, to read, to paint, to engage in discussions about politics and philosophy. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt her mind awaken, her spirit begin to mend. The emotional healing was a slow and delicate process. The scars of the Duke's cruelty ran deep, manifesting as sudden anxieties, a tendency to flinch at loud noises, and a lingering distrust of male authority. Lady Agatha, with her gentle wisdom, became Eleanor's mentor. She listened patiently, offered comfort without judgment, and encouraged Eleanor to find her voice again. "Your strength, my dear," Lady Agatha would say, "lies not in enduring, but in reclaiming your own narrative. You are not defined by what he did to you, but by how you choose to live now." Julian visited frequently, his presence a constant source of reassurance. He helped Eleanor navigate the legal complexities of her separation, ensuring her financial independence and her protection from any further contact with the Duke. He also became a true friend, sharing his love of literature and his passion for social reform. His respect for her intellect and his genuine concern for her well-being were a stark contrast to Alistair's disdain. And slowly, Eleanor began to trust again, to believe in the possibility of genuine connection. The Duke, meanwhile, faced his own consequences. The threat of public exposure, coupled with Julian's relentless pressure, forced him to concede to the separation terms. The scandal, though contained, still cast a long shadow over his reputation. His political ambitions suffered, his social standing diminished. He became even more reclusive, his manner a silent testament to his isolation. Rumors circulated about his increasingly erratic behavior, his descent into a bitter solitude. Some whispered that he had lost his mind, others that he was simply reaping what he had sown. Eleanor heard these whispers, but they held little power over her now. His brokenness was his own burden, no longer hers to bear. Eleanor, with Lady Agatha's encouragement, began to volunteer at a local orphanage, teaching the children to read and write. The work was fulfilling, connecting her to a world beyond the gilded cages of aristocratic society. She found joy in the children's eager faces, in their small triumphs, and in the simple act of making a difference. Her artistic talents, long suppressed, also began to re-emerge. She set up an easel in her sunlit room, painting landscapes and portraits with a newfound freedom and expressiveness. One afternoon, as she was painting a vibrant scene of the Bath countryside, Julian arrived with news. The final papers for her separation were complete. She was legally free, with a substantial allowance that ensured her independence. He handed her the documents, his smile warm and genuine. Eleanor took the papers, her hands trembling, but this time not from fear, but from the profound weight of her newfound freedom. She was no longer the Duchess of Ashworth, trapped and bruised. She was Eleanor Beaumont again, a woman with her own name, her own future. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have given me my life back." He squeezed her hand. "You reclaimed it, Eleanor. I merely helped you find the path." She looked out the window at the bustling streets of Bath, at the vibrant life unfolding before her. The journey had been arduous, marked by pain and despair, but she had emerged from the darkness. She had faced her tormentor, found her voice, and discovered an inner strength she never knew she possessed. The path to freedom had been long, but she had walked it, step by courageous step, towards a future of her own making. She was no longer a victim, but a survivor, ready to embrace the boundless possibilities of a life reclaimed. Months turned into a year, and then two. The seasons cycled through Bath, bringing with them new colours, new sounds, and a renewed sense of purpose for Eleanor. She had fully embraced her independence, shedding the last vestiges of the fear and shame that had once defined her. Her life with Lady Agatha continued to be a source of joy and intellectual stimulation. They travelled, attended lectures, and hosted lively salons where Eleanor, once so timid, now engaged in spirited debates and shared her insightful observations. Eleanor's work at the orphanage blossomed. She not only taught the children, but also established a small art program, believing in the power of creative expression to heal and inspire. Her own paintings, once a private solace, began to gain recognition. Lady Agatha, ever her champion, arranged for a small exhibition at a local gallery. Eleanor's landscapes, imbued with a deep sense of peace and resilience, and her portraits, capturing the quiet dignity of her subjects, garnered praise from critics and the public alike. She sold several pieces, finding a new sense of accomplishment and financial autonomy. Her relationship with Julian deepened into a profound and tender affection. He had been her steadfast ally, her confidant, and her friend. He saw her not as the bruised duchess, but as the intelligent, compassionate, and courageous woman she truly was. Their shared values, their mutual respect, and their quiet understanding of each other's souls forged a bond that transcended mere friendship. One crisp autumn evening, as they walked through the Royal Crescent Gardens, Julian confessed his feelings, not with grand pronouncements, but with a gentle sincerity that touched Eleanor's heart. She, in turn, admitted her own growing love for him. Their union, born not of societal obligation, but of genuine affection and shared experience, was a testament to the healing power of true connection. They married quietly, surrounded by Lady Agatha, Mrs. Finch, and a few close friends, choosing a life of quiet happiness over grand spectacle. The Duke of Ashworth's fate was a stark contrast to Eleanor's flourishing life. Isolated and increasingly unstable, he had retreated entirely from public life. His estates fell into disrepair, his influence waned, and his name became synonymous with scandal and eccentricity. Rumours persisted that he had succumbed to a deep melancholy, haunted by his past actions. Some said he saw ghosts in the manor, others that he simply withered away, consumed by his own bitterness. Eleanor heard these tales, but they no longer held any power over her. She felt a pang of pity, perhaps, for the broken man he had become, but no regret for the choices she had made. His suffering was a consequence of his own cruelty, a burden he alone carried. One afternoon, Eleanor stood before one of her finished canvases, a vibrant depiction of a woman standing strong against a stormy sky, her back to the viewer, but her posture radiating defiance and hope. She reflected on her journey, from the terrified young woman trapped in a golden cage, bearing silent bruises, to the independent artist and loving wife she had become. The memory of the dropped candle, the moment her secret was revealed, still held a vivid place in her mind, but it was no longer a source of shame. Instead, it was a reminder of the turning point, the catalyst that had forced her to confront her reality and fight for her freedom. Her life was no longer dictated by fear or the expectations of others. She lived authentically, guided by her own values, surrounded by love and purpose. She had learned that true strength lay not in enduring silently, but in speaking out, in seeking help, and in daring to reclaim one's own narrative. The bruises on her back had faded, but the lessons they taught had forged an unbreakable spirit. Eleanor, once the silent sufferer, was now a woman fully alive, a testament to courage, resilience, and the enduring power of a life truly reclaimed. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more captivating tales, and leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are listening from. Your support helps this story travel further than I could ever imagine.